Hello, welcome to Baltic World, the premier channel for news and international affairs affecting Northern, Central and Eastern Europe. My name is Crispin, and today I'm going to discuss the defence of the Baltic States. There has been a landmark new book published this week by America's most eminent and sophisticated military strategist, Elbridge Colby, called The Strategy of Denial. In it, he deals in a clear-sighted way with the rise of China, its bid for Asian primacy, and the threat this poses to the United States, and specifically what strategy the United States needs to employ to prevent China realizing its global ambitions. Most of the book focuses about Chinese invasion of Taiwan and America's need to prevent a fait accompli and to defeat China in a limited conflict. Now, this book contains such open analysis that hitherto this would have been highly classified. Now, I've known Bridge for many years. He is, in my estimation, the very best strategist that America has produced of his generation. And he authored the National Security Strategy in 2018 of the United States, in which he said that terrorism was no longer the primary threat posed to America, but really the resurgence of great power competition, specifically the rise of China. In this book, he had much to say about NATO and defense of the Baltic States. Specifically, that the threat posed by China to Taiwan gravely undermines America's ability to defend the Baltic States. I'm going to read directly from his book, and then we will talk about it. One scenario for which the United States might reasonably make provision for simultaneous action is a potential Russian attack on NATO member states in Eastern Europe. The reason is twofold. First, unlike any potential US adversary other than China, Russia does have a plausible way by which it could seize and hold the key territory of a US ally, even in the face of US resistance. Second, Europe is one of the key regions of the world. The fundamental stake at issue for the United States is denying Russia or any other state hegemony over Europe. No state, including Russia, has any realistic prospect of attaining predominance over Europe for the foreseeable future, in part because there's already an anti-hegemonic alliance there, NATO. The United States therefore has a potent interest in the maintenance of the alliance and thus the effective defense of its member states. NATO has, however, grown much larger than is necessary to achieve the goal of denying another state hegemony over Europe. Today, it encompasses most of the European continent, including all of its large states except for Russia and Ukraine. Measured solely by membership, it boasts much more than a favourable regional balance of power in Europe vis-à-vis Russia, something close to an overwhelming preponderance. It could be considerably smaller and still fulfill the fundamental task of denying another state hegemony over Europe. Now, I'll just pause there for a second and discuss what he means by all of that. During the Cold War, America's objective was to prevent the Soviet Union marching across Western Europe. Indeed, such a threat did this pose that it was worth America initiating even a nuclear conflict to prevent that eventuality. Any invasion of West Germany by the Soviet Union would be an immediate threat to France and the UK, and therefore an attack on one is an attack on all, like Article 5 of the NATO Charter. When the Cold War ended, NATO expanded right up to the Russian border. Estonia is only 150 kilometers from St. Petersburg. It is not necessary from an American strategic point of view for the Baltic states to be members of NATO for NATO to fulfill its core function, i.e. prevent Russian conquest of Europe. Therefore, defending the Baltic states is not a critical core strategic interest of the United States except to preserve its credibility with its other allies around the world. I'll continue. Some NATO states, moreover, are difficult to defend. But the critical issue is that withdrawing alliance commitments is much more problematic than never making them in the first place. Accordingly, withdrawing commitments from NATO states would surely have significant reverberations. Even more, failing to mount an effective defence of member states could undermine the alliance's differentiated credibility, possibly enough to cause it to fissure or even break apart. What he's saying there, essentially, is that expanding NATO to Russia's border was a strategic error in the context of American strategic priorities. That is, if the Baltic states were not currently members of NATO, given the rise of China and the threat posed to Taiwan and America in the Western Pacific, it is highly improbable that the United States would include the Baltic states in NATO and commit to its defense and security in the way that it now has. That said, now that the Baltic states have successfully joined NATO, expelling them from NATO, or worse, not defending them at all, would gravely undermine American credibility with other allies around the world with whom it is utterly dependent. So not only in terms of Europe, but let's say the Baltic states were invaded, well, how would people perceive it in Japan or South Korea or Australia if the Americans didn't do anything about it, given the NATO Charter is abundantly clear that you must defend them from foreign threats. Consequently, although the alliance has room to give in terms of its power margin over Russia, it must also consider the implications of withdrawing commitments from existing members. The question, then, is whether existing member states can be defended at a tolerable cost while the United States and other allies are fighting or preparing to fight a war in the Pacific, and consistent with the primary US interest of upholding the anti-hegemonic coalition of Asia. Ever since the Second World War, the United States has had a policy of being able to defeat any two countries simultaneously in conflict, wherever they are in the world. So during the Second World War, America defeated both Imperial Japan and Fascist Germany at the same time, in different theaters in different parts of the world. And after the Second World War, such preponderance of American power was such that they expanded that policy over all of their war planning. So when they invaded Afghanistan, they also could invade Iraq, for example. Well, today there is a recognition that America's power is not unlimited and it can't do everything everywhere. That is, Asia is by far and away America's main strategic priority, and it must build forces and deploy military power in a way that deals with the Asian theatre. And they're very different. If we think about the map of the world, the Pacific is thousands of kilometers of ocean, right? You need naval power, you need air power. Whereas if we're talking about defending Europe, they're mostly army and land units. And thus, you can't divide a limited power base across the entirety of the world in all different contingencies and defend everything everywhere. What Bridge is saying there is that the Chinese could invade Taiwan, America could be embroiled in a war, and the Russian government opportunistically might invade and seize the Baltic states. Would the United States, already embroiled a war with a major hegemonic superpower, be able to start a second front next to the Russian border in the Russian year abroad? And Bridge is rightly questioning the capability of the United States to do that and the wisdom of the United States to do that. Russia's plausible theory of victory against NATO is a fait accompli strategy rooted in its proximity to the alliance's easternmost members and its possession of sophisticated conventional forces as well as a large and varied nuclear arsenal. It does not have the practical ability to seize and hold non-contiguous NATO territory in the face of Allied opposition. Moscow could not plausibly project power across a resistant Ukraine or the Black Sea to seize and hold, for instance, Romania or Bulgaria. Northeastern NATO is different. Here, Russia directly borders the Baltic states and Poland, and Moscow enjoys a substantial local, conventional military superiority over the Baltics and possibly at least parts of Poland. This is due to several factors. One is the weakness of the small Baltic states, whose militaries pale in comparison to Russia's. A second is geography. These countries occupy a narrow strip of territory sandwiched between Russia and the Baltic Sea. Forces placed there are more vulnerable to attack, especially surprise attack from Russia. A third is the thinness of the broader Allied defence posture in Eastern NATO, a result of the alliance's decisions not to build up its defence posture in the states NATO added after the Soviet Union's collapse. Although NATO has strengthened its defences in the East in recent years, Russia may still be able to generate local superiority and possibly a significant degree of it. And here we reach the crux of the issue. First, a fait accompli strategy, as Bridge has outlined, is a major power such as Russia seizing territory, obtaining absolute control over that area, then defending, building up forces and fortifying that territory so as it would need to be retaken with considerable cost. So for example, the invasions of Normandy during the D-Day in 1944 was the Americans and the British and allies landing on the beaches against heavily fortified entrenched positions, doing so such as at Omaha at enormous blood and treasure. Far better than having to retake territory is to prevent an enemy force from being able to capture it and control it in the first place, i.e. having a strong defense in depth that would allow military defenders to repel an attack, in this case from Russia, and force them back across their own borders. Bridge points to several problems with that. First, the great distance that NATO forces have to project power, whereas Russia is doing it right across its own border. The geography of the Baltic States is also unfavourable. It's very narrow, it's very flat, and it's backed by the Baltic Sea. So if Russia captures the Baltic States, others will have to project power across the North Sea in order to be able to retake that territory, i.e. it could involve an amphibious landing against heavily fortified Russian positions in order to recapture the Baltic States and liberate them from occupation. And then also the fact is that when NATO expanded eastward, that did not come with a commensurate degree of military buildup, i.e. West Germany during the Cold War was heavily militarized, deeply fortified with multi-layered defenses. When NATO expanded eastward, it was mostly on paper. They said, yes, you have joined NATO, you've got the protections of the NATO Charter, but it wasn't like the United States and the Western European allies were building up massive military bases in these eastern NATO territories, but rather they were kind of leaving them mostly undefended so as not to antagonize and increase tensions with Russia. Now, in the book, Elbridge Colby actually recognizes that the Baltic states may not be defensible by the United States alone. That is, if the United States is embroiled in a quagmire over Taiwan or the Philippines, deep conflict with China in the middle of a major war in the Pacific, and Russia was to opportunistically invade the Baltic states, the Americans would have to sacrifice the Baltic states rather than compromise its military position in Asia, which for America is the primary theatre of operations. So what's the solution? Well, Bridge calls out in an open and direct way, and I wholeheartedly agree with him, the total failure of the Western European countries to step up to the plate. Germany spends about 1.2% of its GDP on defense. That is abysmal. The minimal NATO threshold is 2% of GDP. Germany's economy is about 3 times that of Russia. Germany alone, if it just pulled its weight, would be able to defend the Baltic states. At the moment, the Poles and the Baltic states are reliant heavily on the United States, and this is not going to be sustainable going forward. The Western European allies have consistently in polling shown great reluctance to fight a war with Russia over the security of the Baltic states, and that needs to change. Can't just continue to fight to the very last American. They actually need to step up themselves and allow the United States to defend the free world against the rise of China. China, which is already threatening not only the countries in Asia, but as I've said in previous videos, been bullying the Baltic states itself as well. So it's in everybody's interest that the United States be allowed to focus on its primary strategic competitor, and that the Europeans actually do something to defend Europe. I mean, I was seeing people saying, oh, the Europeans will be able to do more in the Indo-Pacific and we can do things as a collaboration. The Europeans aren't even defending Europe. And Bridge is absolutely right to say that countries like Germany, to a lesser degree France and others, really do need to invest in their own defense and support their Baltic comrades. Because if they don't, the Baltic states could be lost to Russian aggression, which wouldn't just undermine the Baltic states, of course, which would fall back into repression and control, but also destroy NATO, because the United States would be unable to retake a heavily fortified position that was controlled by Russian forces with a real serious risk of nuclear escalation without the Europeans actually doing the heavy lifting. So what needs to happen? The Europeans need to build up their military defenses. They need to provide greater deployments of their own conventional troops in the Baltic states to slow any potential Russian advance that could happen. And if the Russians don't have confidence that they could seize the Baltic states in a fait accompli, that they actually could be a proper defense mounted, then they're very unlikely to try this in the first place. There is no point for Russia to take advantage of the fact that the Americans are embroiled in a conflict in the Pacific if the Europeans have themselves developed significant military power and deployed it to defend the Baltic states. I mean, that would be silly of Russia to do that. So that is what Bridge recommends. I totally concur with his recommendations in terms of Germany and others increasing their military expenditure. I also reluctantly accept his perspective on the defensibility of the Baltic states and Russia's strategic perceptions when it comes to their near abroad threat. After all, 3 major invasions of Russia occurred through that territory: the Swedes, Napoleon, and of course the Barbarossa campaign under fascist Germany. This gives Russia a strong incentive to want to control the Baltic states, even though the Baltic states are the beacon of democracy and Western civilization, whose foreign policy does seem to be based on the most ideal principles, and therefore we do have a moral, social, civilizational obligation to make sure that they enjoy freedom and security for the perpetual future. That's my view. Happy to hear your comments down below. The Strategy of Denial is the greatest book on strategy in the modern era. It will shape American thinking for decades to come. It lays down a theoretical framework for which all American forces will be developed in the future. I have no doubt about that. I'll leave a link to the book below. Please pick it up. It will help you understand the threat posed to the Baltic region as well as much of the rest of the world. And I will see you next time. Thank you so much. Goodbye.